Okay, welcome back, everyone. So last time we were talking about the age of Jackson and all the economic developments of the 1830s and 40s, and we ended with the election of 1840. William Henry Harrison wins. Very tragically, he dies 30 days into his presidency, and we have John Tyler. So it's almost as if fate intervened to overturn this election and take it from the Whigs, and an actual Democrat is in office. So we're going to move on now to the Antebellum Period is the title of this one. So antebellum is just Latin for before the war. So antebellum's usually charted as the era immediately before the war. You might say, well, before Civil War could be anything prior to 1861. Technically, we're really looking at the key moment that is going to exacerbate a lot of problems will be the Mexican War, which actually we won't get to at this one. We'll talk about that on the next one. But after the Mexican War, there's this huge fight. What do we do with all those Western territories that we conquered from Mexico, slave or free? And the issues that reared their ugly head in 1820 are not so easily dealt with in the 1850s. There had been quite a bit of divergence between North and South. And so let's talk about those two divergent systems. So first, looking at the North. So the North attracted many, many more immigrants. There were just a few large cities in the South, predominantly New Orleans, that attracted a few immigrants to do free labor jobs, factory work, dock loading stuff. Other than that, nearly all immigrants would be attracted to the North. How does one compete with slave labor? You can't. And so Irish immigrants, German immigrants, those are the two largest immigrant groups coming into the US prior to the Civil War. And they came in large numbers in the 1830s, and especially in the 1840s and 50s. There was a flood of immigration. Now, the US is a nation of immigrants, but we go in phases. Sometimes immigration is heavier than in other times. And at this particular time period, it was very heavy. If you see the statistic at the top, in the 1820s, it's estimated only 1.6% of Americans were born outside of the United States, which is very small, historically speaking, number of immigrants. By 1860, about 11.2%. That's pretty big, historically speaking. The only time periods where it was a bit higher is around the year 1910. We were at our peak of all time. It was about 13, 14%. And lately, since, roughly the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, immigration's been pretty high. It did go down during the Great Recession, during the early 2000 teens. Then it went back up. And now it's back down again, largely because of the pandemic. But roughly the statistic now is about 13, 14%. So it's pretty high now. It was pretty high around, 100 years ago, 1910, in the teens also. But in 1860, just prior to the Civil War, immigration was very high, predominantly because of these two groups. Now, let's compare and contrast the two. By far, the more desperate of the two groups will be the Irish. The Irish, believe it or not, are one of the most hated immigrant groups ever to come to the United States, probably the most hated immigrant group. The way that the Irish were received in big cities like in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, but especially Boston, of all places, was not so welcome. Now, this seems crazy to us today because who's anti-Irish today? But at the time, they were treated terribly. And again, it's weird because this is a group that is white, Christian, English speaking, and still they were treated like scum when they came to the US. Now, the predominant reason for this is that they were Catholic. Now, this is the first non-Protestant group ever to voluntarily immigrate to the US. Now, the people we talked about before, the Scots-Irish, they're not ethnically Irish, they're not Celtic, they don't speak Gaelic. They were Scots-Irish, that means basically English. Their families had moved to Northern Ireland, they had lived there 100 years, but they had maintained their kind of insular ethnic identity as like Presbyterians or Anglicans, And then they moved, some of them Puritans and Congregationalists, and then they moved to America in the 1740s, 50s, 60s. That's the Scots-Irish. Now we have people from Southern Ireland, the Irish Catholic. Now they first start coming in decent numbers in the 1820s and 30s, largely because of industrialization. They get jobs in factories, digging these canals, blowing apart mountains for the Erie Canal, laying railroad tracks. We needed them. But as some individuals have noticed, that when you allow immigrants in, you think you're getting workers and you're actually importing citizens as well, meaning a lot of people think these immigrants will come and then they'll leave. They're going to put down roots and they're going to stay. And a lot of folks are not going to be cool with that. They were Catholic, and this caused a lot of friction because of anti-Catholic prejudice. Some of it a little warranted, to be honest. The Catholic Church of the 1830s and 40s is way different than the Catholic Church today. I mean, today, Pope Francis is such a cool dude, right? Very recently, Pope Francis came out and said there shouldn't be discrimination against the LGBTQ community. He's a scientist in favor of evolution and global warming. Catholic Church is much more enlightened today than it used to be, and it has explicitly endorsed democracy as a form of government. That's post-World War II, though. Prior to World War II, the Catholic Church was explicitly anti-democratic, saying that democracy is a terrible system and it's doomed to fail. We should have monarchies instead. So the fear is, how could we have this population of people who are technically American, but their religious leaders are saying that they live in a terrible country? And it was true that bishops were saying this in New York City and Philadelphia and Boston. And so, of course, there was a tremendous amount of anti-Catholic prejudice. In fact, in Philadelphia, the first Catholic cathedral ever built in 1804 had been firebombed so many times that they just took out all the windows of the bottom story and put all their stained glass windows up much higher, because so many people would make little Molotov cocktails and throw them in to burn the cathedral down. So there's a lot of ethnic strife. Wherever the Irish go, there's groups that don't want to hire them, don't want to give them a bank account. You can't walk into a bank in Boston and say, "Hi, my name is Seamus O'Shaughnessy and I'd like a bank account." You would get laughed out of the place. And yes, that is a name. I love Irish names. They're fantastic. And that is like the most, that is Irish right there. Seamus, you guys know the name Seamus? S-E-A-M-U-S, that's a name. O'Shaughnessy, right? Don't even ask me how to pronounce that. O apostrophe and a lot of crazy letters after that, right? You know, great names like Patrick Flanagan and, you know, Samuel Malone and stuff like that. McHenry, O. Henry, right? All of these Irish names were identifiable. If you went to Catholic Church, you'd be identifiable. And there was tremendous discrimination in both the public and the private sector. All you were really going to be, if you were an ignorant Paddy from Ireland, you were just going to be a ditch digger or a railway worker or a dock worker. Nobody thought that they would be anything more than that. Now, the numbers are immense. It is estimated that 1/8 of Ireland, 1/8 of the entire country immigrated to New York City, just one city in the US during this time period. And then it will accelerate in the 1840s because of the Potato Famine. At first in the 1820s and 1830s, they were leaving because there were just no job opportunities. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty. These are economic refugees. Then the horrible Potato Famine happened between 1845 and 1849 for 4 years straight. A fungus infected the potato crop of Ireland, destroying about half of the food supply. Now, remember, Ireland had been conquered by the English in the 1300s. English landlords came in and took all the land and turned all the Irish people into peasants working on these manors. And the Irish would grow grain for their lord for export, and they could grow potatoes on that land for themselves. Well, when you don't diversify and you just go with one crop, things like this can happen. If there's a crop failure, it can lead to famine. You need to diversify and have many different crops. The British didn't really care. And so starting in 1845, there was a huge crop failure. Hundreds of thousands of Irish Catholics died. And the British, not being very nice about this situation, would not let them immigrate to England. They let them freely leave Ireland, but said, "Don't come here. Don't come to London or Liverpool. We don't want you here." They allowed them to go to Australia, which was basically a prison colony, New Zealand, Canada, but the United States took the largest number, and it was the only one of those countries not in the British Empire. And the Irish so hated the British, they decided to come to America as their first choice. Most of these immigrants will come to the United States, and they'll go mostly to Eastbourne cities because they don't have a lot of money to buy farms in the West, and they couldn't get a bank account to borrow the money to buy it. And so they're going to get industrial jobs in big cities in the East Coast, the ones I mentioned: Boston, New York, Baltimore, Philly, those ones. Now, they actually do very well for themselves. They were literally starving to death in Ireland. They come here and they're doing much better. They could actually vote. Amazingly, a lot of people don't know this, federal or national citizenship was very murky at this point, meaning basically you were a citizen of the state that you lived in. And so all citizenship and all the rights of citizenship revolved around states rather than the federal government. It's not until post-Civil War where we get the 14th Amendment and citizenship is largely a national phenomenon. So what this means is each state can decide who gets to vote. Like in America today, that is not the case. You must be a naturalized US citizen to vote. A lot of people don't know this. If you were a white immigrant in the 1840s, you could step off the boat, be illiterate, and still vote because you had white skin. And the Irish, although they're Catholic, some Democrats in New York City realized that it would be easy to get the Irish to vote for them. Very easy indeed. So this is where the term political machines comes into operation. It's not literally a machine, but here's how it works. Parties in big cities tried to get people to vote for them essentially by buying their votes. So here's how it works. You have a ship come into New York Harbor. It's filled with Irish refugees. They step off the boat, and there's someone from the Democratic Party right there passing out pamphlets to them right when they get off the boat, telling them, "Welcome to America. We're glad that you're here. Here is the address of a tenement house where you can rent a room. Here is where your local cathedral is, so you can talk to the bishop or priest in your archdiocese, get your kids baptized, and all the 7 sacraments. Here's where your local parochial school is going to be, your Catholic school, because these Whigs, they're going to take your kids and send them to public schools, and they're going to marry Protestants and forget everything about the mother country. And most importantly, here's where the local tavern or saloon is." And I don't say that because of stereotypes about the Irish drinking a lot, which I kind of do, but I'm Irish, I get to say that stuff. It is kind of true though. Really, taverns, saloons, the Irish didn't hang out there necessarily for the booze. They were hanging out there because that's how you got plugged into the social network. It was the Facebook or Instagram or whatever of its time. And here's what I mean. Owners of saloons usually doubled, meaning they would own a saloon, but that was just to organize their day job, which was being an alderman. Now, we don't have this position here on the West Coast. An alderman is technically the equivalent of like city council member. And so you had to get elected every couple of years. And so you would build businesses in the community that you represented and establish relationships. And if you're a Democrat, the Irish is your base. 40% here, it says, of New York City was immigrant by 1860. That's a lot of votes from your Irish population. And so you'd set up a tavern, they would come in. And so first you got games, you got darts, you got billiards, you got that. That's fun to hang out. Second, it would be your bank. It would be impossible with an Irish last name, a Catholic last name, to go into a bank and get a bank account. But you could go and put any money into a safe in a bank, and you could actually get paper bills for it or even checks to draw credit. You could leave messages for people. It's like, oh, I got to go a job digging the Erie Canal up in the Catskills, and my cousin is coming in from Ireland next week. I want to leave a message and some money for him, and I've written him and told him to come here to this tavern. So you could leave messages for people. And it's kind of how you got jobs, because if you vote for that alderman and he gets elected, he gets a prorated per capita number of people to hire, right? So it's like, we got this big city project. We're going to build a subway system. That comes a bit later in the early 1900s, but let's just say we're going to build a subway system and we're going to need to hire 10,000 workers, and I get to hire 80. So who's he going to hire? He's going to hire his patrons. So let's say Joe. Joe's the name of this tavern keeper. He was your buddy. Now, the weird thing is Joe is not a Catholic and probably hates Catholics, but at the same time, he kind of loves them because they're the ones that are keeping him elected. Okay. Now, Democrats out in the rural areas of New York were Protestant and they loved the Democratic Party, but it wasn't enough. The Whig Party was really strong in the North, and you needed Irish immigrants to add to your numbers in order to win, and this was the way that it was done. So numbers of Irish are huge. 1/8 of all of Ireland moves to New York City. 1/4 of all of Ireland moves to the US. I have never heard of anything like this in my life, just in a short time period, in 25 years. 1/4 of one country moved to another country, and we peacefully absorbed them. There was no war. There were certainly tensions and problems, but amazingly, they thrive in America. They do very well. They had a dirt floor in a thatched roof shack in Ireland, and when they moved to America, they lived in tenements, which were not nice, but they had plaster walls, a wooden floor, and they had plaster ceilings, you know, super hot in the summer, super cold in the winter, but you had, you know, if you went down the 5 flights of stairs, there was a water pump there, and it was a good life. Jobs were aplenty, wages were pretty high in America, and you weren't starving to death. It was the land of opportunity. So, what else can we say about the Irish? That's about it. You got the basics on them. Let's move on to the Germans, the Deutsch. So the Germans, a lot of people don't know this, they will come in twice the numbers that the Irish do. And the primary reason for that is that Germany is just such a larger country. Like today, Germany, last I checked, has a population around 80 million or so. Ireland has a population today of about 4 million. Just to show you how devastating the potato famine was, Ireland had a bigger population in 1840 than it does today in 2020. Half the population of Ireland disappeared in about 30 years. 1/4 emigrated and left Ireland, another 1/4 died, and people have been leaving ever since. They don't really get surplus population because until recently, until the 1980s, they were a very poor European country. And so they never grew that fast. There was always a population leaving. So Ireland's small, and even though 1/4 of the country comes to the US, it's a small country. Germany, on the other hand, is an enormous country, and a tinier percentage of Germans come here, but it's twice the number of Irish. Now, 2 types of Germans will come to the US. The first is what you might call dislocated farmers. Because Germany is a much smaller country than the US, land prices were much higher. If you had a mortgage on a farm, it was just barely getting by. Your profit margins were just razor thin. So what do? You sell your land at the high prices there in Germany. You then get on a boat and you go to America and you buy land for much cheaper. And Germans will not typically live in big cities in the US. Some of them do, of course, the poorer ones, but most are going to move, I'm sorry, I think I said the Midwest. They are going to go to the Midwest. They're not going to go to the East Coast. They're not in large numbers. Are they going to go to New York City and Baltimore and Philly and Boston? A little bit, but largely they are going to go to places like Ohio, Illinois, Missouri, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, certain degree the plains of Texas, but they're going to move out west and buy land and live kind of amongst their own and themselves. They're going to be middle class, so they're not the poorest of the poor. The other group of Germans that come are what are often called 48ers. Not 49ers, but 48ers. 48ers means there was a wave of revolutions in 1848 in Europe. Pretty much every country had a revolution, except for Britain and Russia. Every other country. Rome had a revolution. Paris had a revolution. Austria, Vienna, and Budapest had a revolution. Every major country did. But not all of them were successful. In fact, many of them, they were aborted or overturned. And so it was the German liberals, the people that didn't want an emperor or a prince anymore. They wanted a republic like America. They wanted a weaker monarchy. They wanted a parliament, it's a Reichstag, et cetera, et cetera. And when this revolution failed, the intellectual class fled. So this would be journalists, newspaper writers, it would be college professors, high school teachers, the intelligentsia, so this is librarians and, you know, people that work for the foreign ministry, etc. These people who wanted reforms for a long time, and they went out in the streets and marched for revolution. And then when the emperor brought his troops out and brutally crushed this revolt, they said, well, we're going to get killed unless we go to America. And so they left. These people were very well-to-do. They didn't own land because they were sort of urban educated elites. But these are people that are highly mobile and they move all the time. And so most of them spoke English already. Many of them were educated in England, at Oxford and Cambridge, and they spoke English rather well. Most of them spoke 3-4 languages. I kind of liken this group to the Cubans who immigrated to the US in the early 1960s. They were the wealthiest people in Cuba. Why did they leave? Because the communists were taking all their businesses, property, land, bank accounts, etc. Most of them spoke English already. So when they went to Florida, it was not that hard to start their lives over. I mean, sure, it was difficult, but it would be kind of like if I had to leave the country, if something terrible happened. I don't really speak any foreign languages, but I would learn as hard as I could. I would say, I'm not going to go back to Costco and work in, you know, someplace like that because I have 2 college degrees. I will figure out how to sit behind a desk and I'll work that skill. Okay. And so this is the 48ers. This is what they do. And they come to America and they do very well. They open up newspapers here, some of them in English, some of them in German, some of them do both. And they do very well for themselves. You can see this pattern replicated, meaning if you look at Nebraska, if you look at Wisconsin, these areas are still heavily German to this day. Or Scandinavian. Lots of Scandinavians moved to these areas as well. Scandinavia, if you don't know, is Northern Europe, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland. Mostly we get Swedes in the largest numbers, a few Norwegians moving to places like Minnesota. And so these people have last names like Johansson, Gustafsson, Lundegard with 2 A's, you know, these funny names. That's Minnesota largely. Scandinavians are very similar to Germans ethnically and culturally. And so these people moved to the upper Midwest and they do very well for themselves. One of the most famous was a gentleman by the name of Adolphus Busch. He opened one of the first large breweries in America. If you guys don't know, and I hope you don't know, like so many food products, like I mentioned last time, cheese and our meats and stuff like that, American food is usually considered poor quality, but huge in quantity. The same thing for our beer. If you ask most people who are beer snobs, like my brother, he brews his own beer and he knows this kind of stuff. American beers like Budweiser and Miller, they were brought here by Germans. Germans drink lager, English drink ale. I guess they're different. I don't quite know the difference. I don't drink beer. And the English brought ale to America, but it was always considered poor quality. The English are not known for their ales, like, you know, their beers like Newcastle and stuff. Most people say they're not very good. They don't even refrigerate it. They drink it warm, right? The Germans are very snooty about their beer. They make Becks and sort of higher quality stuff. And it was Germans who brought Busch, B-U-S-C-H, Budweiser, Miller, these are German brand names, and several others, Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz. These are all German names, and they open up these huge breweries. Well, Busch was the biggest of them, and he bought out all the other smaller ones, and he built an empire. He had 5 mansions on 2 separate continents, both in Europe and the US. He had his own newspaper printed in German. He was an all-American guy, and America gave him the opportunity to do that. So the Germans obviously do much better, and there's actually less discrimination against them, even though most of them speak a different language. Many of them knew English, but they have this kind of funny accent and they speak a totally different language. Part of this reason is that slightly over half of German immigrants were not Catholic, they were Protestant. Germany's about the only country in Europe that's divided, meaning the southern half is Catholic and the northern half is Protestant. Back then there was no Germany, there was no Deutschland, like unified country. The northern part was a loose confederation of states called Prussia. The southern part was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And people that left the Austrian portion of Germany were Catholic. People that left Prussia were Protestant. And Protestant, it doesn't really matter what your ethnicity is, you're A-okay, right? If you were Dutch, if you were Swedish, if you're, you know, from northern Prussia, you're good. And so there was far less discrimination against them. The Irish get it far worse. I think I mentioned last time that the first public school system in America opened in the 1830s in Boston because the city council was getting so upset that the Irish poured in and they were sending their kids to these private schools. Well, so were waspy Protestant Americans because there were no public schools, but the fear was we're going to have a permanent, separate, and segregated population in the US that's hostile to our, wants and desires and everything. And so the idea was we would open public schools and assimilate kids. After Boston does it, New York City does it, Philadelphia does it, Baltimore does it. Every major city in the North is going to adopt public schools. The South doesn't get public schools until after the Civil War. They didn't believe in them. They didn't really have immigrants. So it was done on the one hand with good reason to educate this immigrant population of children so they have job opportunities. They're not just going to be a ditch digger like their parents. They were going to be clerks, policemen, firefighters. They were going to do well in the political machine and get promoted. By the turn of the 20th century, by 1900, the metropolitan police forces of most major cities were all Irish. This is sort of a stereotype, you watch TV shows and they're like, Sergeant Kelly, what do you think about this? Why has he got an Irish name? Because still to this day, most, at least East Coast major cities, there's a large Irish population that controls the police force. They got that through Tammany Hall, through this political machine. Urbanization. This goes along with industrialization. Americans were more and more gravitating towards cities, even though they were wretched, awful places to live back then. Disease, fire, theft, crime. There was all kinds of awful problems there, but there were opportunities, both for the middle class and the working class. You could work in a factory, you could work in a dock, or you could be a clerk or an accountant or a lawyer in a big city. By 1860, 20%, 1 out of every 5 Americans lived in a big city. In 1820, it was only 7%. It was a rather small number. This is because more and more factories are opening up, predominantly in the North. New York City explodes in population, predominantly because of the Erie Canal. In 1830, there were only 200,000 people in New York City. By 1860, there were 1 million. And by the end of the century, by 1898, when the 5 boroughs of New York City, when Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island all merge and incorporate in 1898, they become the largest city on earth, the greater New York City area, with 5 million residents. So in 1 century, they go from 200,000 to 5 million people. It multiplies 25-fold in 1 century, which is just unbelievable. New York's a much newer city. If you go to Paris, London, Athens, these are old cities with lots of ruins and stuff. New York really is a city of the 1800s, the 19th century. It was founded in, 1624 by the Dutch, but it was really just a cow pasture until the early 1800s. That's when most of the residences were built. So let's move on to the next one. Let's talk about the Second Great Awakening. So hopefully you remember the First Great Awakening. This was in the 1730s and 40s. And remember, it was a conservative backlash to how the Enlightenment had watered down mostly the Congregationalist Church of New England, but also the Anglican Church. And many people kind of felt in the 1730s, not everybody, but especially the poor and working class felt, we want to go back 100 years to the 1630s when we were poor, simple farmers, but we were pure and pious, and now our religion's been totally watered down to nothing. The Second Great Awakening is much more positive. It is, dare I say, probably the most beautiful expression that Christianity has ever had, because this is the only time that I'm aware of where Christianity was not spread by the sword or by a king forcing his subjects, or conquerors coming in and forcing subjects to convert. It was instead spread not by the state, but by just individual churches, dealing with those issues we talked about before, right? The alcohol consumption rates, the illegitimacy rates, the crime rates, all of these went way up in the early 1800s. Finally, there was a big backlash and churches proliferated north and south all across the country. In 1770, there was not a single Methodist in the United States. 50 years later, by 1820, it is the largest denomination in the United States. And it still is the biggest Protestant church. The Catholic Church has more in total numbers. There are more Protestants in America than Catholics, but they're so subdivided. And of all the Protestant churches, still the Methodist Church is the largest. And they were formed with this kind of reforming spirit. The idea here is perfectionism, meaning you can perfect society through the Gospels. So this is beautiful and elegant, I think. Much better use of Christianity than shaming people and you're going to go to hell and God hates you. But no, no, no. If you're an alcoholic, if you're a prostitute, if you are a murderer, we don't care what you have done. Brother, sister, come into our church, read the Bible, pray hard to get strength, and we can offer you a better life. Come into the community. And so there was this intense religious fervor, North and South, and it lasted about 30 years from the 1820s to the 1850s, spreading all throughout the country. So what were some of these movements? Well, one was the prison and asylum reform movement. Prisons and asylums were wretched, awful places, and churches wanted to reform them, make them kinder and gentler, which was great. Sabbatarianism, this is sort of the darker side of some of these reforms. Unfortunately, when reform movements start in America, often there's a wonderful spirit to it, but there's some group that just wants to go too far. This is Sabbatarianism. Sabbatarianism means in the countryside, everybody stays home on Sundays because they can, but in big cities, people don't. Catholics didn't really obey the Sabbath as much as Protestants do. It's interesting how Catholics and Protestants view things differently, like drinking. Catholics feel you can drink. Protestants say, no, you can't. Gambling, Catholics say you can, Protestants say you can't. And so the stereotype emerges. Protestants are stuffy and uptight, and Catholics are, freewheeling and fun. Guess there's a grain of truth in it. I think I've said this before, but generally speaking, my point of view is Catholics, no matter where you live, if it's the Philippines, America, Mexico, Italy, France, you love life. You have good food, you love family, you love music, you're not too uptight about stuff. Protestants tend to be everything's sinful and everything's wrong and everything's improper to show emotion or anything. And so you don't dance at family gatherings, you don't do that kind of stuff. And so this is where this grain of truth kind of comes about, is during this time period. The feeling was these Irish immigrants that come into the country, they just work all week and then they blow their money on the weekend and they don't save. There's no thrift, there's no investment, there's no sending your kids to college, there's no saving for tomorrow. It's just live for today. Whatever happens, happens. This sort of Catholic fatalism, right? Whatever happens, God wills it. Whereas Protestants say, no, you make your own luck and you make your own life. So Protestants during this time were really trying to convert Catholics and just convert undecided people out there who weren't really religious and say, we have the solution. We're going to get people off of alcohol and we're going to get people back into churches on Sundays. Because in big cities, people got to work on Sunday, right? It's actually Sunday now while I'm doing this lecture. And most of you probably, I would imagine, don't think I should be executed for that. Technically, the Old Testament says you should. It says if your neighbor works on a Sunday, you should call him out to the authorities and said individual will be stoned to death. Not very nice. Most of us today say, well, that's metaphorical. They didn't really mean that. Sabbatarians said, yeah, but we can close the taverns and we can close the businesses. So these quote unquote Sunday blue laws come about. I don't know why they call blue, but that's what they're called. And basically businesses are forcibly closed on Sundays. Mostly in New England, this takes place, but several other places pass these too. What could be less capitalistic or free market than that? You must be closed 1 out of every 7 days, 14% of the time. Now, you guys know today that very few things are actually closed on Sundays. Banks are. Chick-fil-A is voluntarily. That's about it. Almost everything else is open on Sundays because you're forfeiting 14% of your profits, right? Sunday's a weekend day. There's a lot of business to be done. And so to me, this is a bunch of busybodies with too much time on their hands who have this attitude I don't like, which is we're going to force you to do it and you're going to thank me in the end because it's good for you. I know what's better for you than even you do. Similarly, businesses that want to stop gambling establishments or, drinking establishments or anything like that, right? Temperance was another one of these movements. Now, temperance didn't go so far as to try to shut down all the taverns or alcohol distribution centers. What they were trying to do is convince people just to stop drinking. They basically said in industrial areas, it's not good to drink all day. Remember, Americans were drinking about 7 drinks per day, which is an insane amount of liquor. People didn't live long enough to get liver disease back then. You would die at 50 of tuberculosis or something. So in a society like we have today, people drink far less, and actually Americans drink far less than Europeans do. The only people that drink more are college-age kids. Unfortunately, our college-age kids, it's a weird rite of passage where you're away from your parents the first time. There's a lot of binge drinking on college campuses. Other than that, every other demographic drinks far less than Europeans do. It's just part of their culture. Americans are far more uptight. I don't know if you guys are aware of this. We have the highest drinking age of any country on earth, 21. Most countries, it's 18. I think in Mexico, it's 18. In Britain, it's 17. In continental Europe, it's 16. In many European countries, it's like if you can see over the bar, you can order a drink. It's no big deal. In America, part of this goes back to the Second Great Awakening and the Temperance movement. You go to Presbyterian or Baptist or Methodist church, they would make all the men come at the lectern in the front of the church and swear before God and the congregation that they would either stop drinking. You'd take the T for total pledge, that you would go totally abstinent and not drink anything. Other people would say, well, I'll drink, just on occasion. If you took the T for total pledge, you were called a teetotaler. So if you guys have ever heard that term, I don't know if you ever have, but I'll use it a few times in this class. I'll say, oh, Teddy Roosevelt was a teetotaler. I'll talk about him later. Never drank a drop of alcohol, but he did drink a gallon of coffee a day. Yes, a gallon, which I don't know how many cups that is, but that's a lot. Maybe even worse than having a drink every now and then. Teetotaler, that's what it means, is that you never drink a drink. Our current president, right? Donald Trump, even people that are not very fond of the president, they seem to say that's a good thing I like about him, is that he's a teetotaler. It's okay to be an adult in America and not drink. You should be able to do that, right? And he's one of them. So that was the temperance movement. Education, talked about that before. There's a good side and a bad side to it. The good side is let's give immigrants and poor people skills so that they could be well-versed in this industrial economy and have the skills to survive. The downside of it is that this was done deliberately to beat the Irish out of the Irish. In fact, a lot of these teachers changed these kids' names, right? They come in and they say, what's your name? Sean? S-E-A-N? No, it's Sean. And you're like, Sean, that's a weird name. You could be Sean, but it's going to be S-H-A-W-N. And so a lot of things like that were done, where American teachers kind of, crack down on this kind of stuff to forcibly assimilate kids as much as they could. 1827, Boston Public Schools, the first to do it. Prostitution was another issue during this time period that very much upset these sort of social reforming Protestants. It may shock you guys to find out that technically prostitution was illegal everywhere, but there was this sort of weird relationship that police chiefs had with houses of prostitution, where they basically said, look, we'll never get rid of prostitution entirely. It's called the world's oldest profession. No society has ever totally gotten rid of prostitution. We need to follow a policy that we'll call harm reduction, meaning it's going to exist, so how do we make it exist in the least harmful form that we can? So police chiefs would basically say, look, there's this 10 square block area here in this area of town. It's away from schools, it's away from other businesses, it's away from neighborhoods where good, decent Protestant folk live. You can open up a house of prostitution in this 10 square block area. Police will patrol the area to make sure that prostitutes are safe. They will be inside of houses of prostitutions, brothels, bordellos, whatever you want to call them. They will be, there'll be security inside of them. They'll be well protected. And this way you won't have streetwalkers. You won't have prostitutes out walking the streets. It's in your face. They're not as safe. They're not as well protected. And the police would they would ask for a bribe basically from those houses of prostitution, from the gentleman or woman who ran the place. And so this was the kind of cozy relationship that was had. And you better believe this really upset a lot of social reformers, that this was being just ignored in most major cities. And so they would pass these very strict laws to shut down the houses of prostitution. They'd be shut down. And guess what? The problem didn't go away. It just got worse. So in some ways, this social reform movement out of the churches, out of the Second Great Awakening, was wonderful. Alcohol consumption rates were too high. And we didn't ban liquor. We just used the guilt of churches, basically, and the social pressure there to get people to stop drinking as much. And the results were much better. Other things like Sabbatarianism and like the failure of the prostitution reform movement, they didn't really turn up results. They had this dogmatic attitude that no good Protestant woman would ever voluntarily become a prostitute. Therefore, they must be kidnapped victims and we have to rescue them. And when they shut down these houses of prostitution, they assumed that they would just find all the girls and women, their families, and they would be happy. And most of them said, I didn't ask to be rescued. I had an option. I could go work in a factory making $2 a week, or I could make $10, $20 a week as a prostitute. And I don't mind the moral issues here. And so this was done voluntarily. So some successes, some failures out of the social reform movement. Now let's talk about the churches themselves, because the mainstream, rather large Protestant denominations will be Methodism, Baptism, and Pentecostalism, Presbyterianism too. And the smaller movement of apocalyptic religions would happen as well, but it's kind of curious that this explodes in the 1840s. So here's what I mean. Historians have found that during times of immense social change, some people freak out. They think the world's coming to an end. They're looking for answers. Things are moving too fast. And so they experiment with alternative forms of living. So for instance, in the 1960s, there was a tremendous amount of social change. A lot of people weren't coping well. And a lot of young people said, I want to try to experiment with a different way to live. And they joined these sort of hippie communes, the counterculture movement. We're going to try to live without money or currency. We're going to have communal property. We'll just sort of fish for our food and plant a vegetable garden. And we'll just live together and sing songs instead of just getting up and going to work every day. Now, it was, I guess, noble experiment that totally failed. None of these hippie communes are alive in existence anymore. And likewise, in the 1840s, there was an explosion of churches doing this. Congregation members would leave their jobs, go move to upstate New York. They'd buy a plot of land in the wilderness, cut down all the trees, and try to start a big communal farm. They'd live there for 4 or 5 years, and then it would just fail, and they'd move back to the big city. This area was known as the burned over district, and it was called that because just new congregations would spring up like wildfire, spread through upstate New York. There'd be 20 of these churches, and then poof, they would just vanish, and then another one would come about. So what were some of these groups? The first one was known as the Millerites. William Miller was convinced that Christ was returning, and he even set a date, October 22nd, 1843. Which, little advice, if you're going to form a cult and you're going to tell people the world is coming to an end, keep it vague. The end is coming soon. It's been prophesied. If you set a date and it doesn't happen, then you look really dumb. And that's what happened here. He actually set a date. He had read the Book of Revelations. And if you ever read the Book of Revelations, it's very confusing. I can't make heads or tail of it, but a lot of people have read it, and it seems to describe the end of times. This is known as eschatology, how the world will end. Religions try to explain that. How is this grand experiment, the human existence on Earth, going to end? And it's going to end at the Battle of Armageddon between good and evil, basically. A lot of other stuff happens, but people like me, I can't make heads or tail. I don't know what's happening in the Book of Revelations. It's very confusing. William Miller said, I get it, and it's happening October 22nd, 1843. They all bought these white ascension robes and put them on. They held hands, and they waited at midnight, hoping they would be raptured up into heaven, and it never happened. And so they turned to William Miller and say, Dear leader, what happened? And he said, let me check. And he did a little computation. He said, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. I forgot to carry the 1 in my arithmetic. It's going to happen in 1844, next year. I'm positive. And most of them go, oh, whew. Well, I'm relieved. I thought for a minute you might have been mistaken and not know what you're talking about. So the movement tries to keep with them. They go out again next year. Nothing happens. After 4 or 5 years of this, the movement largely dies out. And most people say, this guy's just full of BS and I'm leaving. And so the movement changes its name from the Millerites to the Seventh-day Adventists. William Miller says, I must have been wrong about the Book of Revelations. But my big reform, number 1, is that we have our Sabbath on the wrong day. The Jews are right. Christians are wrong. In the Bible, it says that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and rested on the 7th. The 7th day of the week is Saturday. Remember, Sunday's the first day of the week. Yet Christians still have their Sabbath on Sunday. So this is the only Christian denomination I'm aware of. Maybe there's another one, but the Seventh-day Adventists have moved their worship ceremonies to Saturday. Their second innovation is it's the only Christian denomination I'm aware of that has dietary restrictions. I suppose the Church of Latter-day Saints does a little bit too, but and I forget exactly what they are, but Seventh-day Adventists are known for being, of all the religions in America, they have the highest life expectancy because they're nearly vegetarians. They eat very healthy, and they have all these like strict guidelines on what you can eat and drink and stuff like that. So that's the Millerites. The second is the Shakers. As you can see, they sound a lot like the Quakers. Well, they did start off as Quakers. Remember, Quakers are called Quakers because they quaked in church, meaning that they had no preacher. It was completely democratic, meaning you would come in and the Holy Spirit was supposedly jumping you, and you would get up and you would sort of tremble and start preaching and talking in tongues and stuff. And then you would fall down and the Holy Spirit would jump into someone else and you would sort of, preach like that. The Shakers were an offshoot. It was a group of Quakers that then founded their own church. They had a few other ideas, and they would tremble and quake and sort of do this dance around the church, and everybody made fun of them and called them Shakers. Now, they had some very out there views on a lot of different stuff. They wanted to live in complete isolation, own land in the wilderness, and they believed in complete and total celibacy for everyone, including married couples. Now, if you don't know what celibacy means, it basically means that you can never have sexual relations. Even married couples, which, just from a practical standpoint, if you're a church and you want to grow your numbers, this is a really bad policy, right? Like, how are you going to grow your numbers as a church if there's no babies and all of your congregation will die off in 50 years? You need to have new people born into the church or get a bunch of converts. And that's what they tried to do. They converted a lot of people. They did wonderful things like adopt thousands of orphans that nobody else wanted. This is the era of Oliver Twist, if you've ever read that, the Charles Dickens story. Like, if you ever read Charles Dickens, industrialization in big cities, this was a big problem. Birth control was terrible back then. And so you had your 5th, 6th, 7th kid, you couldn't take care of them, you just dropped them off outside the fire station. There were tens of thousands of orphans all over England and America. And people like the Shakers were wonderful. They went out and adopted them. Most of these orphans, though, they're going to grow up and go, y'all are kind of weird, and I'm going to leave. I'm going to become a Methodist because at least they can have children, right? So this movement will die out as well. It was really popular for a few years, and then it just died out. The Oneidas were the complete opposite. These people were really wacky. They were preaching free love long before the hippies were. The Oneidas, taking their name from a tribe, that Native American tribe that lived in upstate New York, called themselves this. And if you ever heard of Oneida Knives, they're the ones that invented it. It was a bunch of silversmiths who started, making knives, and communally, that's what they did. They bought land and they trained everybody there to make knives, and they sold them to get money to run the church. And John Humphrey Noyes was the founder of this faith. And like many of these founders of kind of, extreme religions, largely he wanted to sleep with all the wives of his, congregation, basically. And so he came up with this rather weird theory, and sorry if I'm judgy, but it's very weird to me. He felt that human beings were unbelievably kind and would sacrifice so much for their blood relatives, for their children, for their parents. But it was like everybody else could just kind of go to hell, right? And I kind of feel that way a lot of times too, right? A stranger knocks on my door, they need help. How do I know this isn't a scam and you're going to rob me? Get out of my face. Go get a job. But for my son, for my wife, I would do anything. And John Humphrey Noyes said, why can't we take that attitude people have towards their families and project it out to the world? What if we created a world where no one knew whose kids were whose kids? And so they created a world where monogamy was sinful. Like having relations with just one person and pledging yourself to just one person was wrong. It was limiting love. It was making it possessive, meaning this is my wife and these are my children. No, they're everyone's children, man. They're God's children. I kind of imagine them as sort of 1840s hippies, so I have that, hippie accent. And so to me, this was excessively weird, right? The idea would be that you would just sort of rotate kids, right? I mean, moms would know, obviously, who their kids were. Who's the father? Ain't no Maury show back in the 1840s, and you don't know who the father is. It could be anyone in the congregation because they're practicing free love. Anybody could have a romantic relationship with anybody, and there'd be no judging, and it would be perfect. To me, this is just weird. It's weird. I'm sorry. And I think there's just a natural human instinct to bond with your blood. Nothing wrong with adopting children and treating them as your own, but I think there's undoubtedly a biological link that's very strong, and you love your own kids more than you love yourself. And to kind of get away from that and build a society where just nobody knows whose kids are whose kids, to me, that's kind of wacky. And of course it failed. There were also groups that had nothing to do with religion at all. Remember, this is the age of Marxism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, a scathing indictment of capitalism. Many people felt, yeah, this is a brand new system. I don't think it's natural. Remember that there were no 8-hour workday. You just worked 12, 16-hour days, 6 days to 6.5 days a week. You'd have only Sundays off. And many people just thought this is not natural. So a lot of socialist and communist groups like New Harmony and Phalanxes, they'd have groups that would go and buy land and try to live communally as actual communists. And again, these movements largely failed too. The greatest failure of communism is its incentivization structure, right? How they structure incentives, meaning what is your incentive on a communal farm to work extra hard when the benefits will be marginal for the whole group and you don't get the benefits personally? You won't. And that's typically what happens in these societies, that the government takes over a factory or a farm. Usually they're not as productive and it doesn't work as well. For all the flaws of capitalism, people work hard because they get the benefits. And greed is a terrible human instinct, but if you channel it in the right direction, it's good for everyone. Because if, a corn farmer works as hard as he can, he'll produce more corn, the price will get lower because everybody is producing more corn, and that's better for the economy and population as a whole. Communism just has not produced those results yet in any society I'm aware of anyway. And finally, the only one of these groups that's still with us today is the Church of Latter-day Saints. I guess you could say the Millerites as well, but they totally changed and they gave up a lot of their core beliefs, but so did the Church of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon Church, as most outsiders know it. So it was part and parcel of this larger movement of apocalyptic religions. In the early 1830s, Joseph Smith, resident of upstate New York, and I'll try to be neutral here. I don't want to offend anyone who's in the Church of Latter-day Saints, but I'm going to take a historical perspective of this and try to explain it as an outsider. He believed, and he had convinced a lot of people, that he had a new revelation from God. And it gets rather complex. There's, I believe, a white salamander who, came out and revealed itself to him and showed him underneath the Catskill Mountains where these golden plates were buried. And then they had this ancient language that he then translated, and he wrote the Book of Mormon, which, again, if you are Mormon or LDS, I'll probably butcher this, and my apologies, but as I understand it, the Book of Mormon basically, although it doesn't say this explicitly, this is sort of implied, what or how, I guess, does America fit into the over biblical scheme? Meaning, Joseph Smith kind of looked around America and said, Christianity is largely a religion of the Middle East. What was going on here? Who were the Native Americans? And so the idea was that there were Jews thousands of years ago who kind of crossed the ocean. I think they got lost in a storm, I forget. They landed in America and they still had their faith, and they populated and they grew real big. This is all before the white people crossed the Atlantic and quote unquote discovered America. And these tribes, who were, I guess, suppose they were Israelites, they still had this faith of the Jewish tradition, but then they split into two, and one tribe did not have the faith and the others did. And the good, pious group of Israelites was defeated, and the last one, who still had the truth, buried the plates under the mountains, and that's what Joseph Smith found. Now, the reason why Native Americans are not Christian is they had lost their faith. The side that was paganistic and trying to fight against the old faith won, and that explains it all. That's kind of the idea of it. And so Joseph Smith had this fiery kind of magnetic personality. Thousands of people followed him, but they were very unpopular with mainstream America because of two beliefs. Number one, they believed in community property, which Americans firmly believe you got to have individual private property. Number two, and this is much more controversial, they practiced polygamy, that under the Church of Latter-day Saints, men can have up to 4 wives, and to Americans, that just seemed terrible. And as bad as America was at the time in terms of the patriarchy, at least you have to hand it to them that their argument against it was that polygamy was misogynistic, that it turned women into slaves, basically, and that women had more equality in a monogamous marriage, which I tend to believe as well. Now, to defend the Church of Latter-day Saints, I will say, they get way too much grief for this today. The Mormon Church has officially renounced polygamy 130 years ago in 1890, and they still get grief. I remember when Mitt Romney ran for president in 2012, people found out he was a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, and they'd crack jokes that he had 5 different wives. He did not. Now, some of you might say, now, wait a minute. I saw Sister Wives, or I saw some show on A&E, or I saw Big Love, and there's Mormons that still have multiple wives. Those aren't Mormons. Those are splinter groups that broke off from the Mormon Church in 1890 when the Church Fathers in 1890, realizing Utah was never going to become a state unless they went mainstream, finally said, okay, we will change this practice and we will not have community property anymore. Now, you still have to give a tithe forcibly. I forget what it is. I think it's 10, 15%. Forgive me, I forget. But it's one of the few churches, the Mormon Church, where you have to give. But you can still hold private property and own your own home, and etc. Second, they renounced polygamy forever. But that's much later in the 1890s. In the 1830s and 40s, they were chased out of upstate New York. They moved west to Illinois. Joseph Smith there was ripped to shreds by an angry mob, he and his brother. So Brigham Young took them out west to Missouri, where they were further told that they were not welcome. So they left Missouri, the gateway to the west, and they marched about 1,000 miles all the way to Utah, which was part of Mexico in 1844. It wasn't even the US. 3 years later, the US would conquer that territory and envelop it, but it was far off the beaten path and far out of everybody's way. And so that's the Church of Latter-day Saints, essentially. They had dietary restrictions, no drinking alcohol or caffeine-based drinks like coffee and tea and stuff like that. They believed in hard work. And it is the fastest growing religion in America today. It is rather small compared to bigger Protestant groups, but it is growing very fast because of their example that they set to everybody else, right? That they have these wonderful missionaries who come into your town and help local communities out, and many people join. Okay, let me see. Been going on for a while here. So I think, well, I'll go ahead and just wrap this up. So part of this overall movement as well was abolitionism. Now, abolitionism did not exist prior to 1831. There were people that were kind of against slavery, but even Northerners tended to keep their mouths shut because they wanted to keep the Union together. They didn't want to offend Southerners. All of a sudden in 1831, abolitionism explodes on the scene with William Lloyd Garrison writing this newspaper, The Liberator. It was a weekly newspaper that all they talked about was the evils of slavery. In his first edition, William Lloyd Garrison says, I will be as harsh as truth and uncompromising as justice. Slavery is evil, and I will not rest until it's abolished, and I shall be heard. And ever since that issue came out, other ones came out. The Emancipator came out a couple of years later, and then more and more and more, and the movement grew every year. Now, abolitionists, you have to understand, like a lot of us would say, if I was in the 1840s, I'd be an abolitionist. They were so cool. Probably you would not. Most people did not like them. Even Abraham Lincoln in 1860 distanced himself from them. He said, I think slavery's terrible, but to be an abolitionist means that slavery should be abolished immediately without compensation. Even people that were against slavery tended to be more moderate, but the abolitionists said, no compensation. You are wicked and evil for doing it. And so most Americans didn't like him, even in the North. There was a very famous case of Elijah Lovejoy, a Presbyterian, who had a shop where he made his own abolitionist newspaper in Illinois, in a northern town, and a pro-slavery mob broke into his printing shop, murdered him, and threw him, his dead body, and his printing press into the Mississippi River, killing him. And so this was a movement of radicals, pretty much. Now, it grew and grew and grew and become much bigger, but at first it was just sort of these Protestant ministers, Elijah Lovejoy, William Lloyd Garrison, etc. Then you started to get Black abolitionists, actual escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass, pictured here, or Sojourner Truth, or Harriet Tubman, who said, yeah, you can criticize slavery from a biblical perspective, but I've actually lived it. Let me tell you about my life. Frederick Douglass is an amazing individual. He was born a slave, We don't know for sure, but probably his father was his own master. So meaning he was half black, half white. And his master took a little bit of pity on him and allowed him to learn to read and write. When he became an adult, he was allowed to work on weekends in Baltimore Harbor and keep some money on his own. And he actually saved up, and he tried to escape several times and kept getting caught. But he saved up enough money to actually purchase his freedom. Excuse me. Then he went up north from Maryland and started writing, giving lectures, giving speeches. He met with President Lincoln numerous times, traveled the world, gave all kinds of lectures, and he was a genius. And he tried to use his own example, saying, I am a black man, and I wrote this book. Do you think that we're still inferior? And it convinced a lot of people. He was amazing. Same thing with Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and several other former slaves. There were women in this movement, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the best-selling book up to that point in America, other than the Bible, was Uncle Tom's Cabin. It comes out in 1852, and it was a scathing indictment of the slavery system. The Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, they had inherited a plantation in South Carolina. Their father owned one of the largest cotton plantations, and they left. They said, this is such a wicked, awful system. You Northerners don't even know. And they talked about the feminist aspect of slavery, how slave owners took liberties with black females, raping them essentially, humiliating their black husbands, humiliating their white wives, humiliating their daughters. And they just said, no man should have this much power. God does not want human beings to have this much power over each other. This is just wicked, evil, and awful. Lots of great pamphlets came out where there would be a black man or a black woman in chains, and on it would say, am I not a brother and a man? Or am I not a sister and a woman? And sort of asking the question, isn't a black man still a man? And should we not be doing this to each other? God would take vengeance on us. This is an evil, awful thing. Lots of reforms based on this. Oberlin College was basically built by abolitionists coming up with a radical idea that both men and women and black and white would go to school together. People laughed at this. They thought this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of, especially Southerners ridiculed it, laughed at it. And guess what? This is the model for every college everywhere in the world right now. And Oberlin was the first to do it. It was very radical at the time to allow women to go to school with men and to allow free blacks to attend school with free whites. And it worked fine. It was a model for the world. Soon, the abolitionists had a political party. The Liberty Party was founded in 1840 by James Birney. He was a former slave owner from Alabama who, again, freed all his slaves and was run out of town in Alabama, came to the North, founded a party, and said, I won't rest until slavery is abolished. Now, he gets 1-2% of the vote in that election, but the party grows. In 1848, the abolitionists kind of reformed themselves and said, well, if we run as a national party and say, let's abolish slavery entirely tomorrow, people won't vote for us. But what if we say free soil, meaning we just conquered half of Mexico, let's keep slavery out of the new territories, but where it exists already, it's up to those states. This movement got 10% of the vote, and a former president, Martin Van Buren, actually ran on the ticket. He got so offended because he ran in 1840 and lost after he had already been president, and he tried to run again in 1844. The party rejected him and picked slave-owning James K. Polk, and in 1848, they went with, oh, forgive me, I'm forgetting, but it was another pro-slavery candidate. In any case, he felt the Democratic Party had been taken over by Southern slave owners. It always had a place for Yankees in the North. He was fine in the 1820s and 30s, but now they were basically saying, you're a New Yorker, you're not welcome because you don't own slaves and you're not going to protect slavery. So he founded the Free Soil Party. That party then morphs with Northern Whigs into the Republican Party. They get more votes in the election of 1856. They get about 45% of the vote. And in 1860, they capture the White House. Now, again, Lincoln was no abolitionist, but basically the Republican Party was a free soil party, an anti-slavery party. So this movement grows and grows and grows. It's kind of how I look at a lot of movements when I was a kid, the vegetarian movement, the animal rights movement, the gay rights movement. None of these had much steam in it. I know, you guys may look at a lot of adults and say, you're ancient. I feel like I graduated not that long ago. I graduated in 1997 in Garden Grove, just 7 or 8 freeway exits from you guys. Nobody I knew in high school was openly gay. Nobody. That you would lose everything. In the 90s, if you came out in high school, there was no gay straight alliance, no gay clubs, none of that in high school. Still, all of these homophobic insults were perfectly fine to say in the 90s, and very few people stuck up for the gay rights movement. Now, gay marriage is legal. It's been enshrined by the Supreme Court. We have all this, attitude and education now that it's not cool to use these homophobic insults to each other. That's how the abolitionist movement was. It started off as kind of this kernel that most people just said, you're kind of silly and ridiculous. And it mushroomed, grew, and then slavery was abolished finally in 1865. Side by side with this movement was the women's rights movement. Women kind of took a look around and said, hey, we are the foot soldiers in every one of these movements that's going on right now. Sure, the preachers are all men, but the foot soldiers that are running off copies, passing things out, knocking on doors, organizing, were white, Protestant, middle-class, waspy women. That's who it was, and here's why. Protestant women who were middle class in big cities tended to have fewer kids. Now, if you had 7, 8, 9 kids, basically your entire adult life is just taking care of children. And when when the last one flies the nest, you're probably close to your deathbed. Now, in big cities, these women started to have fewer kids. They had 3 kids or 2 or 4, not that many. And so by the time you were in your 40s, your kids had flown the nest and you were unemployable because you were a woman. You couldn't go out and get a job. Married women, it was not okay for you to do that. Single women, you could go out and work in a factory, but married women, it was considered indecent, and typically you did not. So what are you going to do with all your time? Your husband's a banker or lawyer or architect. He's making plenty of money. You're just going to sit around all day? No, you're going to be an active member of your church and you're going to go try to save the world. I want you guys to note something. This is very weird, and I don't know where it comes from. I don't know if it's biological. I don't know if it's sociological. But what I have noticed, especially since I had a kid, is that women are much more involved in social movements, meaning look at QPC, look at Quest Parent Committee. Is it really parents? Do you see a lot of dads at those meetings? I don't. I've been to several of those meetings, and it should be called the Quest Mom Committee because it's moms who say, I want to be involved at my kid's school and I want the school to be a better place and I'm going to do it. Dads are like, I'm tired. I don't want to do all that stuff. They get dragged along kind of to that, not universally, but basically, this is how this breaks down. Today, still, women are more religious than men. They're more actively involved in their churches, volunteering, et cetera, et cetera. And probably a major reason for that is women have children. They tend to take time off and raise children. And I don't know if there's a biological component to this, but women tend to volunteer more, even in politics. But at the lower level, right, is that if you look at the Senate and House, it's majority male, but look at the foot soldiers in these movements, the people knocking on doors and collecting pamphlets and, trying to further their political movements, almost universally women. So in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, women were the foot soldiers of the Temperance movement, the Sabbatarian movement, the prison reform movement, the anti-prostitution movement, the Abolitionist movement. And then women kind of took a look around at themselves and said, we have proven ourselves in numerous different ways that we're smart, capable, and able to change the world, yet we can't exercise the most basic right in a democracy, and that's the right to vote. Now, the load of bull that men were selling for a long time, and I hadn't really mentioned this, it is in your book, is that men after the revolution said, women, your job, can't vote, can't serve in office, your job is Republican motherhood. What that means is you will be guardians of the Republic. You are going to raise children not to be subjects of a monarch, but to be citizens of a free republic. You're going to teach children about the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. You're going to teach them the values of John Locke and Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. You're going to teach them to think for themselves, question authority. If they're daughters that you have, to be involved in their churches and these reform movements. If they're sons, to vote or to take part in public office. And that's your role, women. And by the 1840s, women said, we want more and we deserve more. So in 1848, the first women's rights conference was held in upstate New York at Seneca Falls in July, the year that revolution is just sweeping Europe, and women meet and they declare that women are equal with men and we deserve the right to vote. Now, no state would grant women the right to vote until Wyoming and Utah do much later in the late 1800s. I believe Wyoming's the first in 1869, and it's Wyoming. So my joke is, yay, both women who lived there got the right to vote. It wasn't that many. California does in 1911, Oregon, Washington, states out west in the frontier, they, for some reason or another, it's not clear why, they offer the right to vote to women about 10 to 20 years earlier than women in the South, Midwest, and East. Not exactly sure why, but the idea springs out of 1848, and all the great suffragettes are there. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, they're all there, very young women at the time. Many of them had just stepped out of the factories they'd been working in little girls, and they started saying, yeah, I got an education, I worked in a factory, I saved up money, and I want to say and how the world is run. And so this is the birth of what's called first wave feminism. Now, feminism has 3 waves to it. We'll get to all of them. Third wave really starts in the 1990s. I don't know if we'll get that far, but we'll definitely do first and second. This is first wave feminism, and it starts here, and it will slowly rise, and it crests in 1920 with the 19th Amendment granting the right to vote. But it leaves a lot of stuff out. Women in the 1920s had the right to vote, but they didn't have the right to work equally with men, get a bank account, any of those rights that women have today. So it took a whole nother wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s to get those rights, but it starts here. Okay, and that's it. Okay, last lecture of this unit is done. Awesome. I will see you guys during the week. Have a good one. Bye-bye.